The concept of violence is a complicated subject that I think needs to be interrogated carefully, along with common assumptions associated with it. First of all, how does one even define it? Is violence a physical act? Is it emotional? How does one think about violence? On first thought, one would probably consider violence to be inherently bad, intrinsically negative. However, I believe that most people, especially under certain conditions, would not consider violence negatively. In conditions of personal humiliation, for example, I would expect that the victims would often, perhaps overwhelmingly, see a violent response as meritorious, an act of revenge, for example. Those initiating the act would certainly consider it commendable. So might those who understand the context of the act, but were not affected by it, either as perpetrators or victims. One observes tremendous support for terrorist violence, for example, when such violence is couched as an act of revenge against injustice. I'm skipping, of course, a lot of stuff, but these are some of the bullet points. At some basic level, this kind of violence feels justified. In films, novels, video games, we observe the valorization of violence on a daily basis. People relate to it personally and find much positive in it. Vigilante violence is in media, from classic literature to computer games, is extremely popular. Under the rubric that will be considered tomorrow when we treat just war, the very term of which some would call an oxymoron, various perspectives were developed in order to justify the radical violence of mass killing in war. Any act that is just, i.e. justified, would be meritorious, at least under certain conditions. Mass violence in war, therefore, at least in some cases, must be considered a societal good. I don't believe we can consider the topic of violence without relating to this problematic of value. The default position is that all violence is inherently bad, but we often claim that violence is necessary. And while it may be rare for people to claim that violence is good, a lot of people relate to it very positively, especially when they are on the giving rather than on the receiving end. Further, how do we define an act of violence? I believe we in this room would find much disagreement about it, though we would probably agree that killing another human being is an unacceptable act of violence. I believe that some would consider killing a steer, a cow, and cutting it up into steaks and hamburger would also be an act of violence, and acceptable, however, because it serves a greater good. Others might argue that that's not really the case, especially if they're vegetarian. If violence can be acceptable or even necessary, then violence is not necessarily negative at all. Under certain circumstances, we consider the killing of a human being to be acceptable, even necessary. In the course of war, for example, in defense when being threatened by violent attack, even without war, or as the result of a legal judgment that determines that the guilty party deserves capital punishment. So when we're thinking about violence, we must think about kinds of violence, or circumstances under which violence is committed. Some people consider the involuntary surgical removal of the part of a little boy's penis to be an unforgivable act of violence. I'm talking about circumcision. Others consider the same act to be a meritorious act of religious commitment and love. Some would consider the involuntary surgical removal of the hand of a thief also to be an unforgivable act of violence, while others would consider that to be a necessary act of justice, even a religious act in response to the will of God. That raises the question of corporal punishment in general. Is spanking a disobedient child a negative violent act? Or is it an appropriate pedagogic strategy? The biblical book of Proverbs includes the statement, famous, "One who spares the rod hates the child, but one who loves her diligently seeks corrective discipline." It can be argued, therefore, that corporal punishment, which some consider a negative violent act, is commended by God, according to Jewish and Christian faith tradition. So far, I've only touched on a few examples of physical violence, but what about verbal violence or emotional violence? These can have terrible consequences, leading to physical violence, even to murder or the self-murder of suicide. How does one make sense of this aspect of violence? There exists a large literature on violence, and various disciplines and approaches define it differently. Psychoanalysis tends to differentiate between violence and aggression. I'm not going to go into detail there. So let's do the World Health Organization definition.
Yeah.
The intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. End. This definition, like most definitions put forth for legal purposes, begs for comment. The major difficulty with this one is the problematic of the words injury and harm, both terms of which are open to interpretation. Take the issue of circumcision just mentioned. To some, the procedure is an injurious act. To others, it's an act of perfection. To some, it causes harm, while to others, it's a benefit. Evolutionary science considers violence to be a basic good, in the sense that the good of natural selection is understood as survival of the species engaged in competition for limited resources. According to evolutionary theory, violence between species is normative and necessary. Some examples would be a lion attacking an antelope for food, or a bird attacking a squirrel that is trying to eat its chicks, or a human slaughtering a steer for meat. Such a perspective would seem to justify the mass killing of animals for sustenance, and the mass killing of pests, such as mosquitoes or rats that threaten the health of human communities. Then there's violence within species. Specialists in this field base violence within species in part on an evolutionary theoretical model of sexual selection. The classic example of sexual selection is intrasexual competition, usually between males, as a means of enabling the fittest, that is, to use Darwin's terminology, to dominate the gene pool, and thus to preserve the species. Duels, therefore, or other forms of violence between men, perhaps even gang violence, could be considered to have value as a means of natural selection. Freud initially followed this basic position, but later extended his thinking on the topic. He initially saw aggression as being a component of the sexual instinct used in the service of mastery, but he later saw aggression as a response to both internal and external threats. It gets more complicated. A related idea in evolutionary science is kin selection theory, which argues that organisms are more altruistic and less competitive toward others as a function of their genetic relatedness. Helping a genetic relative and increasing that person's fitness, even at a cost to oneself, can ultimately be beneficial because of shared genes. It's no surprise that a substantial proportion of violence, particularly homicides within families, takes place between individuals who are not genetically related. This view is adopted by some to authorize eugenics, increasing positive human characteristics through acts that are essentially human breeding, and eliminating negative characteristics through eugenic violence, such as genocide. Violence is typically directed outward, meaning away from the self. The other could be identified by race, religion, gender, or other ways, sometimes through the psychological mechanism known as transference. Violence directed against the self may involve a lack of ability to engage in transference, so that one's anger and pain or hatred cannot be successfully directed outward. In such a case, it can be directed inward, leading to cutting, for example, or even suicide. This is all sort of supported, or one could argue that this is supported by evolutionary theory. The notion of directing violence outward to the other also applies to assumptions about violent behavior. People tend to assume that the other individual or the other community is violent or tends toward violence, which then gives that person or his community license to commit violence against the other in what might be argued as self-defense. even preemptive self-defense. Othering can also dehumanize the other to such an extent that committing violence against him or her feels no different than committing violence against a threatening animal, something of another species. Or if the othering is severe enough, it may need no reason at all for violence against it. These assumptions, drives, and strategies have a profound impact on how we think about violence. I think the topic of violence is going to be a little more complicated between the religious traditions than the topic of freedom. One probable permutation of some of the drives and strategies just noted is the classic Christian view of the Old Testament God as a God that is angry and violent, in contrast to the New Testament God, who is love. This viewpoint is one of many articulations of the ancient drive to essentialize a community considered to be a threat. In this case, Jews as a threat to the early success of Christianity. Christian antagonism toward Jews did not come out of nowhere, of course. Jews and Christians were competing with one another over which expression of monotheism represented the true will of God. And both communities expended significant effort to delegitimize and for some to destroy the other. The strategic distinction between the Old Testament, i.e. the Jewish God, and the New Testament, i.e. Christian God, serves, among other strategies, to prove that Christianity is the one true and meritorious expression of monotheism, despite the existential threat of Jews who refuse to discard their traditional practice in order to accept Christ. A similar move was directed against Islam, which claimed to abrogate both Jewish tradition and Christianity in a similar manner to the claim of Christian supersessionism. In classic Christian polemical thought, Islam was denigrated as a materialist religion, bent on violence in order to achieve its goals, violence, in contrast to Christianity, the religion of the Spirit. Jewish tradition has likewise come to view Christianity as a highly violent religious tradition, based on Jewish suffering under Christian rule. Accusations of religious violence, therefore, to say the least, is a highly contentious topic in religious discourse. When one tries to understand violence from a Jewish perspective, how does one even begin? Do we look at texts from the Hebrew Bible, many of which are clearly violent, as typically Jewish, or even Jewish at all? No form of Judaism anywhere in the world today is practiced according to the norms of the Hebrew Bible. Nor has Jewish practice been anything near biblical for nearly 2 millennia. The norms, rules, and customs found in the Hebrew Bible do not even reflect what we would necessarily consider today religion. While there is not yet full consensus on this issue, scholars in the field increasingly consider Judaism as religion to be a Christian, not a Jewish definition, as Christians labeled the complex social, cultural, spiritual, legal practice of Jews as a false or incomplete religion in order to discredit it, thus privileging their own true or perfected religion. On the other hand, despite the fact that no Jew for some 2,000 years has practiced Jewish life according to biblical norms, it is absolutely impossible to discard the Hebrew violence and the Hebrew Bible and the violence within it as a source of profound inspiration for Jews. Marcion failed to do that for Christians. How much more is the Hebrew Bible inspirational for Jews and for Jewish ideas and practices, despite the obliteration of the last vestiges of biblical Jewish practices with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple? To give one example, the Hebrew Bible provides 3 forms of capital punishment: stoning, burning, and hanging. The rabbis of the Talmud add strangling, but then they make it virtually impossible to carry out any of them. How then should someone writing about violence from a Jewish perspective treat biblical expressions of violence? Are biblical expressions of violence Jewish, or are they biblical? And if one labels them Jewish, what exactly does Jewish mean, since Jewishness is not defined simply by the Hebrew Bible, and labeling Jewishness as religion is inadequate? As must be clear to you by this point in my remarks, I consider part of the problem of the assignment to lie in the fact that the definition of the adjective Jewish does not correlate with the adjective Christianity or Christian, and perhaps also does it not correlate with the adjective Muslim. The organizational structure of the project is at its very core comparative. Jewish tradition and culture is lined up in relation to Christianity and Islam. You notice I didn't say Judaism. I'm not going to be using the term Judaism anymore. But Jewish tradition and culture is lined up in relation to Christianity and Islam, despite the fact that they are different categories. And of course, there can be no comparison without valuation and judgment. The unfortunate history of Christian supersessionism cannot but prejudge the entire enterprise and put Jews and Jewishness on the defensive. You may think I'm being hypersensitive about this or apologetic, but it's difficult for Christians or non-believers of Christian heritage who grew up in a Christian culture, that is, Western culture, to even be aware of the problem. The notion of Judeo-Christian, for example, is a notion that is extremely fraught, because the very term presumes the Judeo to be a necessary first stage that realizes its fulfillment, if not perfection, in the Christian. The term may be a slight improvement for Jews over supersessionism because it presumes fulfillment rather than replacement. If it were supersessionist, then the Judeo would not even be allowed into the term, though some would argue that this is a distinction that does not reflect a difference. The term Judeo-Christian began to be used in the way we currently know it only after World War II and the Holocaust, and significantly in response to these horrors of the 20th century. It essentially turns around and grandfathers the Judeo into the notion as an early stage in the eventual and ultimate preeminence of Christianity. Embedded in that worldview is the evolutionary theory of increasing perfection with the success of the dominant species, in this case, Christianity. Interestingly, the term became popular only as Islam became threatening to Western assumptions about its own superiority. By adding Judeo to Christianity, the notion conveniently formed a Judeo-Christian coalition against the encroachment of Muslims and Islam into the West. Some have argued that the notion is actually inclusive, not as I'm describing it, because it shows the deep commonalities between Judaism and Christianity. In this view, the word order only reflects history, not evolutionary judgment, as both are sophisticated expressions of ethical monotheism. I don't accept that. But Islam is also a sophisticated expression of ethical monotheism. If the term were indeed inclusive, then it should be Judeo-Christian Muslim. But I've never heard anyone use that expression. Because of the unfortunate history of Christian supersessionism that has been so deeply enculturated in Western consciousness, and more recently the related notion of Judeo-Christian that reflects an anxiety about Islam, if not outright Islamophobia, any publication that lines up such loaded issues as violent in religion, one of the classical examples of polemical accusations, is deeply fraught and must be thoroughly interrogated. That's my introduction. I now have a few more comments because I am now responding to the prompts about terminology and theological and philosophical principles. I'm just going to take another 10 minutes or so to deal with the theology and development of the idea in the Jewish tradition. The Christian philosopher, theologian, Jacques Ellul wrote, quote, "It must be recognized that violence is to be found everywhere and at all times, even where people pretend that it does not exist. Every state is founded on violence and cannot maintain itself save by and through violence." End of quote. This is a Christian perspective. Imagine Jewish perspective, since Jews, as community, suffered as the victims of violence for millennia and continue to view the world through lenses colored by victimhood. According to normative Jewish thinking, non-Jews are inherently prone to acts of violence. It is in their nature. The title of the well-known 14th century polemical treatise by the Jewish rabbi Prophet Duran expresses the general thrust of thinking, Klimata Goyim, the disgrace of the Gentiles. Duran had been forcibly converted to Christianity in an outbreak of terrible violence against Jews that began in Seville in 1391 with the murder of some 4,000 Jews and the forced baptism of an equal number which surged through most of Spain during the following year. But Jewish views regarding the violent nature of non-Jews goes back much further in time to the Hebrew Bible and its depiction of this destruction of the ancient Jerusalem temple and other suffering brought about by predation of foreign tribes, kingdoms, and empires. The biblical book of Lamentations, for example, is a dirge for the destruction of Jerusalem. Quote, Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Behold and see our abuse. Our heritage has passed to aliens, our homes to strangers. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We are hotly pursued, exhausted. We are given no rest. We hold out a hand to Egypt, to Assyria, for our fill of bread. Slaves are ruling over us, with none to rescue us from them. We get our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. They have ravaged women in Zion, maidens in the towns of Judah. Princes have been hanged by them. Some of the Psalms are even more vivid in their descriptions. O God, the nations, that is Goyim, have come into your inheritance. They have defiled your holy temple. They have laid Jerusalem in ruins. They have given the bodies of your servants to the birds of the air for food, the flesh of our youthful to the wild animals of the earth. They have poured out their blood like water all around Jerusalem, and there was none to bury them. In the traditional Jewish prayer service that emerged to become canonical in the early centuries of the Common Era, the rabbis, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, or Rabbi Yehuda actually, taught that a man is obligated to recite daily a series of blessings that include the thanking of God that he has not been made a Gentile. There is much antipathy toward non-Jews in Jewish tradition, and much has been written about it. Those who have commented on Jewish views of the outsider often fail to consider the context of its birth and development, the victimhood of Jews, both real and sometimes perceived, that has plagued the Jewish world and worldview for millennia. This Jewish perspective is born of violent victimhood, real and also quite imagined. On the one hand, virtually all Jewish views of victimhood argue that that is Jewishness, like everything else that is their victimhood, like everything else under the sun, is caused by God. Jews suffer because of their sins. It was God's decision to destroy the Jewish temples because of various sins of the Jewish people. The plagues and floods and military destruction brought about by the enemy were all acts of God. On the other hand, those who carried out God's will in the horror and destruction seem to have been happy to do so, unlike God, who was deeply saddened by Jewish suffering. That is because, according to Jewish theological tradition, behind the divine anger is a deeper sense of love for God's people, Israel, who was the first and only people who, according to Jewish thought, truly understands the divine imperative. Of course, Israelites and Judeans have violently persecuted others when they had the power to do so, and I think no less than anyone else. And this is clearly documented. Historically, Jews have not been innocent of committing violence against others or against themselves. But for the last 2,000 years, Jews have lived outside the world of power. They have typically been the victims rather than the perpetrators of violence, and have, as a result, internalized that victimhood. That provides a particularly interesting and complex perspective on violence. On the one hand, violence is hated and avoided. On the other hand, it is longed for, particularly in the form of revenge. In the home service for the Passover, we beseech God, Shvoch hamatcha ala goyim, pour out your wrath on the Gentiles. This is a direct quote from Psalms. Pour out your wrath on the nations, the Gentiles who do not know you, and on the kingdoms that do not call on your name. For they have devoured Jacob, that is a reference to Israel, to the Jews, and have laid waste his habitation. Many Psalms call on God to avenge the enemy. That enemy is sometimes an unnamed individual, sometimes an entire community, and the language can be quite violent. For example, Psalm 58. O God, smash their teeth in their mouth. Shatter the fangs of lions, O Lord. Let them melt, let them vanish like water. Let him, God, aim his arrows, that they be cut down. The righteous man will rejoice when he sees revenge. He will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Men will say, there is then a reward for the righteous. There is indeed divine justice on earth. There's plenty of more examples I'm skipping. Perhaps the most telling singular statement about a Jewish view of violence is the tradition that humanity, and that of course includes Jews, was created with two inclinations or urges, one toward the good and one toward evil. According to this standard, virtually universal Jewish view, humans were created with the inborn and natural capacity for violence. The first thing that God said about humankind after creation was that humans would rule over all of God's creatures, all of God's creation. Genesis 1:26. And God said, let us make humanity in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. Remember what Jacques Ellul teaches. Rulership is impossible without violence. Adam and Eve, the progenitors of all humanity, managed to get themselves expelled from the garden, though the actual story, as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, never one mentions the word sin, nor had either one of them committed any act of violence against God's creatures. We just observed that God commanded human rulership in Genesis 1:26, but until Adam and Eve were banished from the garden, humans never actually exercised rulership over anything. We know nothing more of humanity from the Hebrew Bible, from that story, until the first couple's children grow up. And the next story of humanity is one of horrible violence. That is the story of Cain and Abel. The story is the story of the first murder, the intimate murder of fratricide. Tempting sometimes, but forbidden. Before the act, God says to an enraged Cain, this is very critical, I think, surely, if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, Hatat crouches at the door. Its urge is toward you, yet you can be its master. This word Hatat in the sentence is the first reference to the word that usually means sin in the Hebrew Bible. And it's the only case of that word appearing in the first 19 chapters of Genesis, despite all the terrible errors or sins that we find in the stories of Cain and Abel, the evils of the flood, the Tower of Babel. Yet in the context of the one time that the word appears in Genesis chapter 4, Chatat cannot be understood as sin. It's used there, it signifies an urge, and like many abstract nouns in biblical Hebrew, it is personified and animated, like a wild animal crouching, ready to pounce on an unsuspecting victim. Remember, it says, if you do not do right, Chatat crouches at the door. Its urge is toward you, yet you can be its master. In Genesis 4, the word means the urge to commit violence, crouching within the very personhood of Cain, son of Adam, and part of the genealogical line that would produce all of humanity. This Hatat, then, would presumably be a part of humanity itself. It's wild. The word for crouches here, rovetz, is a word that is never applied to humans, but only to animals. Hatat is a wild thing. It crouches, ready to leap. The urge to violence crouches at the doorway, only an instant away from attacking the civilized human, but from within the human itself, making him into a vicious animal. Note that God does not explicitly create this urge. It just exists. But God himself acknowledges its existence. The very next narrative to be found in the Hebrew Bible is again a story about human violence. This time universal human violence that brought about the great flood. Quote, the earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with Hamas, with violence. When God saw how corrupt the earth was, for the flesh had corrupted its ways on earth, God said to Noah, I've decided to put an end to all flesh because the earth is filled with violence. At the end of the flood story, God says to himself, never again will I doom the earth because of humankind, because the urge or the inclination of humanity is evil from youth. The word here in Hebrew is yetzer, the inclination or urge. Yetzer lev ha'adam ra min ha'orav. The inclination of humanity is evil from youth. This verse is understood in Jewish tradition to reflect one of the deepest and most basic parts of human nature. It is classically explained in a rabbinic statement in the 8th century work called Avot Rabbi Natan. It says, Yetzer Hara Ketzad, what is the meaning of the evil inclination? And it answers, it is said, by the age of 13 years, the evil inclination is greater than the good inclination in humankind. It develops from within the mother's womb and comes with birth. If one begins to profane the Sabbath, that's a sin, it does not prevent it. If one commits murder, it does not prevent it. If one goes to commit a sexual transgression, it does not prevent it. But after 13 years, the inclination for good is born. If one desecrates the Sabbath, the inclination for good says, you idiot, doesn't it say in Exodus so-and-so, whoever profanes it shall be put to death? If one goes to commit murder, it says, you idiot, does it not say? And then there's a kind of movement through these three issues. And it continues. When a person gets excited to commit a lustful act, all of one's limbs obey because the evil inclination rules over the 248 limbs of the body. When one goes to fulfill a commandment, all of one's limbs suffer because the evil inclination within his core rules over the 248 limbs of the human body. The inclination for good is like one who is captive in prison, as it says in Ecclesiastes 4:14. He emerges from prison to rule. That's the inclination for good. So presumably, when you become old enough and you learn enough, your good inclination will be released from prison and overcome your good inclination on earth. There I have a lot of much interesting rabbinic material, but one that I think is very important is a statement by Reish Lakish, who was a rabbinic, very important rabbi at the Talmud, who argues that Satan and the angel of death are actually the human evil inclination. All three are one and the same. It's also interesting to note that the rabbis of the Talmud, based on the sense of the inherent human tendency toward violence, were cognizant of the association of violence with all human drives. This was a kind of pre-modern psychology, an awareness of drives that parallel the view of evolutionary psychology. We can go back even earlier to Breshit Rabbah. It's an early midrash from the 4th or 5th centuries. And with this I'm going to end. Rabbi Nachman bar Shmuel said in the name of Rav Shmuel bar Nachman, it was very good. This is a statement from Genesis 1:31. Vehine tov ma'od, and it was very good. He says, this is the inclination to do good. It was very good. What is it was very good? V'haya tov ma'od. That is the inclination to do good. It was very good. This is the inclination to do evil. How can this be very good? How can the inclination to do evil be very good? And he explains, because if it were not for the evil inclination, no one would build a house, no one would marry and have children, and no one would negotiate in trade. So the evil inclination is like the sex drive, in a way, to the rabbinic mind. Thus, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, all labor and skillful enterprise come from people's envy for one another. I could go on, but I think you're getting the point. This is a complicated issue. And so since we want to have time for discussion, I will end here with a cliffhanger. I don't have a nechemta. There's a common Jewish phrase that you should end your talk with an uplifting moment to make everybody happy. But I don't think that's the purpose here today. Thank you.